Okay, last week we were looking at chapter 38, which was a sort of interlude break in the story of Joseph. The story of Joseph had began back in chapter 37, and then in chapter 38 we had that story concerning Judah and Tamar. And so in chapter 39 we pick up once again the story of Joseph here, and we're going to read verses 1 to 6 to begin with here. Now Joseph was taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his master the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him, and he made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and having him he had no concern for anything but the food which he ate. So the story of Joseph picks up from where it had left off at the end of chapter 37, with Joseph now in Egypt being sold to Potiphar. The Ishmaelites who had taken Joseph to Egypt sold him to an Egyptian named Potiphar, described in verse 1 as an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. So Potiphar is an important official in Pharaoh's court. And we're told here that the Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man in the house of his master Potiphar. Even though he had been taken away from his home and his family, the Lord was still with Joseph. Potiphar saw that the Lord was with Joseph, and that the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hands. But Potiphar, although he would not be a believer in the Lord, recognized that there was something about Joseph that was different. And he was convinced that the Lord, worshipped by Joseph, was present with Joseph. So Joseph found favor in Potiphar's sight, and he was made overseer of his house and put in charge of all that he had. So it was a position of great responsibility and trust. And from the time that he was made overseer, the Lord blessed Potiphar's house for the sake of Joseph. All that Potiphar had both in his house and in his fields, all of this was blessed by the Lord because of Joseph's presence. Potiphar had full confidence and full trust in Joseph's ability and left everything in his charge. He had no concern about anything except what he would eat. So the only concern he had each day was, what am I going to eat for breakfast, or what am I going to eat for lunch? That was the only thing he needed to concern himself with. And so we see the hand of God at work in the events of Joseph's life, whether what was happening to him was good or bad. And Joseph did not allow the actions of his brothers, the actions they had taken against him, to affect him. We don't hear of him complaining or feeling sorry for himself. He simply got on with things and made the best of the situation, and then the Lord blessed him for that. Joseph's success and the blessing of Potiphar's house were all down to the Lord being with Joseph. So Potiphar was benefiting because of Joseph's relationship with the Lord. So the prosperous man then is not the man who is necessarily rich in material things, but rather the man who is blessed by God. We'll read on in the story here from the second part of verse 6 down to verse 18. Now Joseph was handsome and good looking, and after a time his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Lo, having me, my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my hand. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except yourself, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And although she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her, to lie with her, or to be with her. But one day when he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was there in the house, she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. And when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled out of the house, she called to the men of her household and said to them, "See, he has brought among us a Hebrew to insult us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out in a loud voice. And when he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment with me and fled and got out of the house." Then she laid up his garment by her until his master came home. And she told him the same story, saying, "The Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came in to me to insult me. But as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment with me and fled out of the house." Joseph is described here as being handsome and good looking. And Joseph caught the attention of Potiphar's wife, and she began to have desires for him. And we're told that after a time she cast her eyes upon Joseph. She found him to be attractive, and she invited him to sleep with her. However, Joseph refused her advances, and it took an act of strong will and power to refuse her. In replying, Joseph recalled how his master had treated him and how he had no concern about anything in the house, how he has entrusted Joseph with everything in the house, and how Joseph is really equal to him. The only thing he has kept back from Joseph is his own wife, because she is his wife. And so Joseph asks her, "How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" Joseph knew that to sleep with Potiphar's wife would be an act of great wickedness, and it would be a sin against God. Joseph, we see, had respect for his master. He had respect for the marriage relationship, and he had respect for God's standards of behavior. So Joseph was not going to compromise his moral and his spiritual beliefs, even though Potiphar's wife kept pestering him day after day to sleep with her. To deal with repeated temptation day after day is a hard thing, and it takes great strength. But Joseph persistently refused her offers, and in doing so, he risked her wrath. So one day a situation arose which put Joseph in great danger. He had gone into the house to do his work. None of the other men of the house were there, so there was no one else around to witness what might have happened. So now, alone with Joseph, Potiphar's wife caught hold of his garment, and again she repeated her offer to lie with me. Some situations we might find ourselves in require us to run away, and all Joseph could do now was to flee from the house. But in doing so, he had to leave his garment in her hand. Potiphar's wife must have been very angry that Joseph had constantly rebuffed her, but now the garment provided her with the opportunity to make a malicious accusation against him. So the garment became the incriminating evidence against Joseph. And this is the second time that a garment belonging to Joseph has been used in order to deceive. You remember how the brothers had taken Joseph's special garment given to him by his father Jacob, and they had dipped it in animal blood and presented it to Jacob and asked him what he thought of it. And of course, Jacob had jumped to the conclusion that Joseph had been killed by wild animals. And so here we have another garment that is going to cause some problems for Joseph. So she called in the other men of the household now, and before them she accused her husband of bringing a Hebrew into the household in order to insult them. She doesn't use Joseph's name, she refers to him as this Hebrew. And she accuses Joseph of being the one who had tried to sleep with her. And when he came in, she had cried out in a loud voice, which had then caused him to flee. And he left his garment behind. So her claim that she had cried out was her defense, to show that she was unwilling to lie with So now she put the garment aside until her husband came home, and then she repeated the story to him and the accusation. And she implies in this that the fault really lies with Potiphar, her husband, because he was the one who had brought the Hebrew servant amongst us, she says. So she's really expressing her contempt, the contempt she felt for Joseph now. So things were not looking good for Joseph. Often people are presumed to be guilty simply on the basis of an accusation. And on hearing such accusation, people say, well, there's no smoke without fire, or, well, there must be something in it. But that's not always necessarily the case. None of this was true in Joseph's case. He was wholly innocent. He was the victim here of a false accusation. We read on in the story, then verse 19 to the end of the chapter. When his master heard the words which his wife spoke to him, this is the way your servant treated me, his anger was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love, and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's care all the prisoners who were in the prison. And whatever was done there, he was the doer of it. The keeper of the prison paid no heed to anything that was in Joseph's care, because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. When Potiphar came home and heard his wife's story and her accusation, this is the way your servant treated me, his anger was kindled. But we're not told here the object of his anger. Who was he angry at? Was he angry with Joseph? Was he angry with his wife? Was he angry that he was about to lose the best servant he had ever had? So Potiphar then took Joseph and put him into the prison. It's described as the place where the king's prisoners were confined. So this was a special prison for the king's prisoners. Potiphar could have ordered the execution of Joseph. The fact that he did not suggests that Potiphar still looked with favor upon Joseph, and perhaps even doubted his wife's account of what had happened. Anyway, whatever, God's hand was still at work in these events. And although once again he's afflicted by adversity, Joseph was still under God's care. As verse 21 says, the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. So just as Joseph had gained the favor of Potiphar, he now gained the favor of the keeper of the prison. And just as Potiphar had committed everything in his household into Joseph's care, so now the keeper of the prison also entrusts Joseph with the care of all of the other prisoners. It seems that Joseph was running the prison, so a case of the prisoner running the prison. We're told here that in verse 22, whatever was done there, he was the doer of it. So Joseph's being put in charge of the prison. And Joseph's position is summed up in verse 23. The keeper of the prison paid no heed to anything that was in Joseph's care, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. So the Lord did not save Joseph from the false accusations of Potiphar's wife. The Lord did not spare Joseph from prison. The Lord allowed Joseph to experience these things, but the Lord did not desert him. The Lord was with Joseph in the prison and caused the keeper of the prison to look upon him favorably. By his conduct, Joseph showed himself to be someone who was trustworthy, and so the Lord blessed him for that. Joseph provides us with an example of how we are to react to the adverse circumstances that may affect our lives. Instead of complaining about how hard or unfair things are, we should try really to make the best of the situation. And whatever is happening to us, keep on trusting in God to put matters right. We must remain conscious of the presence of God, even in the most difficult of circumstances, because God is still with us. God doesn't always rescue us from those situations, but he will be with us in those situations. The story of Joseph's experience in prison in chapter 40 now, and we'll read chapter 40 verses 1 to 8. Sometime after this, the butler of the king of Egypt and his baker offended their lord, the king of Egypt, and Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief butler and the chief baker, and he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he waited on them, and they continued for some time in custody. And one night they both dreamed, the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, each his own dream, and each dream with its own meaning. When Joseph came to them in the morning and saw them, they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officers, who were with him in custody in his master's house, "Why are your faces downcast today?" They said to him, "We have had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them." And Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell them to me, I pray you." So sometime later, we're not told how much time has passed here, but sometime later, Joseph was joined in the prison by Pharaoh's chief butler, or his cupbearer, and his chief baker. And these were important servants, important officials in Pharaoh's household, who would have had direct access to Pharaoh himself. And both of them had in some way offended Pharaoh. And so they were now put into custody in the prison where Joseph was also being confined. They're being held there whilst their future is to be determined. Captain of the guard put the butler and the baker then into Joseph's care, and Joseph waited upon them. One night both of them had a dream, and when Joseph came to them in the morning, he could see that they were troubled, and he asked them why they were downcast. They explained that they had both had a dream, but there was no one to interpret the meaning of the dreams to them. To the Egyptians, dreams were very important, and they were seen as a way in which the gods would communicate with them. But they needed someone to interpret the meaning of their dreams. And so Joseph replied here, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell them to me, I pray." So Joseph encourages them to tell him their dreams, stating that it is God who gives the ability to interpret the dreams for them. And so we see again how God's hand continues to direct the events in Joseph's life here. The presence of Pharaoh's servants in the prison and the opportunity for Joseph to interpret their dreams would have an impact upon his future. It would be his God-given ability to interpret dreams, which would eventually lead to his own release from the prison. On verses 9 to 15, so the chief butler told his dream to Joseph and said to him, "In my dream there was a vine before me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and the clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. Then Joseph said to him, 'This is its interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand as formerly when you were his butler. But remember me when it is well with you, and do me the kindness, I pray you, to make mention of me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house. For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should put me into the dungeon.'" The chief butler then was the first to describe his dream to Joseph. He had dreamt of this vine with 3 branches. The vine budded, its blossoms shot forth, and the clusters ripened into grapes. So it's as if all this is happening in speeded up motion here, that the process of the growth of the vine. And the butler was holding Pharaoh's cup in his hand, and he squeezed the grapes in Pharaoh's cup, which he then placed in Pharaoh's hand. After hearing the dream, then Joseph gave the interpretation. He said that the 3 branches were 3 days, indicating that within 3 days the butler's head would be lifted up and he would be restored to his position, once again placing the cup into Pharaoh's hand. So having given this optimistic explanation, Joseph then asked the butler to remember him when all was well with him again. He says in verse 14, "And do me this kindness, I pray you, to make mention of me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house." So Joseph is asking the butler to use his influence and present his case to Pharaoh. He had been stolen, he says, out of the land of the Hebrews, and he'd done nothing deserving this imprisonment. So he's asking or pleading with the butler to make his case, to present his case to Pharaoh. We then come to the baker's dream and its interpretation in verses 16 to 19. When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was favorable, he said to Joseph, "I also had a dream. There were 3 cake baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket there were all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating it out of the basket on my head." And Joseph answered, "This is its interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat the flesh from you." Having heard the favourable interpretation given to the butler, the baker now relates his own dream to Joseph, perhaps expecting something similar. And he tells how he had dreamt that he was carrying these 3 baskets of cakes on his head containing all the kinds of baked food for Pharaoh, and the birds were coming down and they were eating the food from the uppermost basket. Joseph then gave the baker the interpretation that the 3 baskets again represented 3 days, meaning that within 3 days Pharaoh would lift up the baker's head and his body would be hung on a tree where the birds would come and feed on his flesh. So to both the butler and the baker, Joseph said that their heads would be lifted up. But in each case, there was a different meaning to that. That in the case of the butler, his head would be lifted up in that he would be raised once again to that position that he had formerly occupied. But as for the baker, the lifting up of his head would mean the removal of his head from his body and the birds then feeding upon his flesh. So we come and see the fulfillment of the dreams in verses 20 to 23. On the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all his servants and lifted up the head of the chief butler and the head of the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief butler to his butlership. He placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand, but he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Joseph's interpretations then came true. On the 3rd day, which happened to be Pharaoh's birthday, a great feast was held for all of his servants. And on that day, the head of the chief butler was lifted up as Pharaoh reinstated him to his position. And once again, he was placing the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But as for the baker, well, his head was also lifted up, in that Joseph's interpretation that the baker would be hanged was indeed fulfilled. However, right at the end there, we're told that the chief butler failed to remember Joseph. He forgot him. And so Joseph's case was not put before Pharaoh, and he continued to languish in the prison and would do so for a further 2 years. In God's plan, in God's timetable of events, it's not yet time for Joseph to leave that prison. So when we think about the two chapters, the events that we've looked at here, a few things for us perhaps to think about. How is God's hand at work in the events of Joseph's life? What do you see there? How do you see God working through those events of his life? What is God doing for Joseph? How did Joseph display his patience under these circumstances? And then how can our own circumstances help our own spiritual growth? What about the things that we have to go through in life, the difficult situations that we may face? How can we be patient in those circumstances? How can they help our own spiritual growth? So a few things for us to consider and think about there.